Welcome to Rock and Stroll Tours of Bath, and we're beginning in the Royal Crescent. I'm Dave Mason, and here are two friends of mine from the rock and roll world in this fantastic city of ours. This is Shaun Smith.
Hello.
And John Baker.
Hi.
And we're going to take you around Bath on a tour that goes back, well, in the first instance, hundreds of years, but more recently, a few decades, because you guys were actually there, weren't you?
I've been here all my life. I've been in bands since 1981, and you've been in bands since longer than that.
About 77 I started, so we've got a bit of a history in the Bath music scene, should we say.
Tell us your connections then, to kick off with, as to how you have absolutely got the credentials to be able to show us around the city today, and what your both your connections are to some of the big musical acts that have come out of this great city.
As I mentioned, Dave, I've lived here all my life. I've played in a few bands, and I've got a relative that was made it very, very big in the 80s, who John knows as well.
Got a name then?
Kurt Smith.
Absolutely. And my history, actually, funnily enough, goes as far back as 1977, when I was at school with the other one of Tears for Fears, Roland Orzabal. We started a band called Graduate, which Kurt joined. That's where I know Shaun from, of course. And then I joined a band called the Corgis, who had international success with a song called Everybody's Gotta Learn Summertime. Been with them for 44 years.
And still going.
Still going.
Fantastic. So what are we going to see today, guys?
We're going to look around Bath and look at the history of the rock and roll, the modern music of Bath, but we'll have interspersed with bits of history of the city as well, because the music history goes past rock and roll well into the 17th century.
We're going to visit some of the places which made Bath iconic, certainly in the 1980s anyway, in the music industry.
Let's start over here.
Our rock and stroll tour is about something not quite rock and roll. Back in the Georgian period, Thomas Lindley lived here at 11 Royal Crescent. He was director of the Assembly Rooms in 1771, and he raised £10,000, now roughly £1.5 million, to buy this wonderful house for his family. Join me at Bath Abbey when we'll continue the story. We're in a street near the Abbey, Abbey Green, where in 1756, Thomas Lindley the Younger was born. He moved to Italy when he was 12 years old, was a contemporary of Mozart, who was also studying in the same area. He died sadly in 1778.
So you might wonder why we're here at St Martin's Hospital in Bath. It's up on the southern slopes. There were two hospitals in Bath in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, and this was one of them. In fact, this was a very big maternity hospital. In fact, I was born here in 1961. One of my co-presenters today on these videos, Shaun Smith, was also born here, a little bit before me. And on the 24th of June in 1961, Shaun's brother, Kurt, was born here. Kurt, of course, being from Tears for Fears. And just behind me down there are the maternity wards of this hospital. But actually, we're going to take you back 1 year before that, into 1960, for a very important story, something else that happened here. Follow me. So as we said, we're going to take you back to 1960, and actually our next story is quite a sad story. But first of all, before we tell you that story, I'm going to ask Dave to take us through where the significance of that fits into British rock and roll history.
Yeah, because as we mentioned when we said we came to St Martin's here, and it's got two significant rock and roll pieces to it. Obviously, Kurt Smith being born here, but sadly a year before Eddie Cochran dying here. He'd been on just the most successful rock and roll tour in the UK that year. And it was that pivotal point between the rise of Elvis Presley in the late 50s and the birth of the Beatles in 1962-63. And what was so significant about that tour is it had done so well with screaming fans and sold out venues throughout the United Kingdom. They had to extend it by 10 weeks. And they played places like Liverpool, where George Harrison, at least one Beatle, had seen that final tour of Gene Vincent and Eddie Cochran play, and it had inspired them, each of the individual members of the Beatles. So much so that on the 6th of July 1957, when Paul McCartney rode on his bike and saw John Lennon playing in Walton Village at the back there of the St Peter's Church, John Lennon and the Quarrymen were playing Bebopalula by Gene Vincent. And when Paul met John and they went back together for their first ever meeting before forming a band, Paul McCartney taught John Lennon how to play 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran. So the influence of Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent cannot be underestimated. And then it all culminates in this tragic accident that really, in this land that we're standing on here at St Martin's Hospital in Bath, is where that all finished. Gene Vincent didn't die, but Eddie Cochran, age 21, sadly did. And John picks up the story.
Yeah, so the story goes that on the 16th of April 1960, Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent were playing a concert at Bristol Hippodrome. At the end of the concert, they wanted to get back to London, so they hired a taxi, a young taxi driver, 19 years old, and the 4 people in the car were the taxi driver, Eddie Cochran, Gene Vincent, and Eddie Cochran's girlfriend, Sharon Sheely, who was a songwriter in her own right. They travelled through Bath. There was no motorway in those days, so the A4 took you through Bath, it took you through Box and Corsham, and up through Chippenham. And as they went through Chippenham, it was a foggy night, visibility wasn't good, the driver was driving far too fast, he lost control of the car on Rowden Hill, Chippenham, and the car went off the road. At that moment, Eddie Cochran was thrown out of the vehicle and he suffered a significant brain injury. There were injuries to all the other passengers in the car as well, including the driver. And eventually they were brought here overnight on that 16th of April. And sadly, the following day at 4:10 in the afternoon on the 17th of April, Eddie Cochran died here at St Martin's Hospital in Bath.
And this is the memorial that has been put here recently to mark the fact that he was a Hollywood film star, a country music star to begin with, and then, of course, was one of the founding pioneers of American rock and roll, which influenced the British rock and roll of the 1960s. And there were lots of 60s acts that came up, of course, after that. What was significant about the accident as well on the night in Chippenham was that a young police cadet arrived at the scene, and that was Dave Dee, who was later to become part of Dave Dee, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch. And he was there on the scene of the night of the accident, and I believe took Eddie Cochran's guitar at the time back to the police station. So a tragic tale, which has far wider consequences than many would realise in terms of the sort of music he could have gone on to make.
Absolutely.
And his body was taken back to California, where he is actually buried there today. But we remember him, of course, in Bath here at St Martin's.
Oh, well, here we are standing outside one of Bath's most iconic music venues, the Bath Pavilion. It was here in the 60s that artists such as the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, The Who, the Beatles played here on June the 10th, 1963. And just adjacent to the Bath Pavilion was an event to happen in 1969 on the recreation ground called the Bath Blues Festival, headlined by Led Zeppelin and Fleetwood Mac. And there was a young gentleman who thought that was a wonderful idea and brought it down to his place in Glastonbury. His name was Michael Levis. Well, this is the earliest part of the Tears for Fears story. We're in Snow Hill, made famous by the song from Kurt Smith, Snow Hill. And it was here that Kurt lived between the ages of 4 and 14 years old. This was like a centre of playground for kids, and people from all the areas would come to Snow Hill and meet and play, especially in the playground up there or on the bomb site up the top there. And
I think it's probably where Roland and his brothers would have come as well, because they were just over in the corner there in the top of Walker, and they probably came over here to play, and they probably met not even knowing it at some
exactly
point, you know,
not even knowing that they met. Well, continuing our rock and stroll tours of Bath, we're in one of the most important areas of the city for music, Walcott, and especially for Tears for Fears and Graduate fans.
Yeah, because this is really where we all met and came together. This street behind me is called Clarence Street, and it's the street where Roland lived from about 1975 till 1980.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah. Look at where we're heading to at the moment.
This has got some history.
Oh, this has some history.
Yeah, absolutely.
And more.
So what we're actually looking at, and it doesn't look much these days, but in there was the famous Crescent Recording Studios. which was opened by David Lord in about November, December 79, after he'd had the studio in his flat in Camden Crescent. And the first band to record here were the Corgis in about December 79. Funnily enough, the second band to do some recording here was a band called Graduate. And for all those Tears for Fears fans out there, Graduate is of course where Roland and Kurt and myself started. This was our first album for Pi Records, recorded there in January 1980.
Perfect. And I remember coming here when Tears for Fears were doing their first ever session, Suffer the Children, their first single ever for Phonogram. Here, they're doing it through the night, doing it in downtime, but it's an important part of the history of music in Bath.
And it's fair to say, you know, apart from Tears for Fears, the Corgis, there were some amazing names that went through these doors. I'm going to tell you a little story now. In about 1984, 85, Peter Gabriel was recording out at his house near Bath, and he'd invited Kate Bush down for the weekend to do some vocals. It probably ended up the vocals on Don't Give Up, that amazing song they did in the mid-80s. But I remember I'd come here, opened this gate, and gone down to the front door to pick up my guitar that I'd left here a couple of days before at a session, and I banged on the door, and who should come to the door to actually greet me but Kate Bush. And as a 23, 24-year-old bloke, I was blown away, as you can imagine. But yeah, some great stories.
Kate Bush, later on I was in the pub, the Bell, and Kate Bush actually came down with Peter Gabriel because he knew Andy Davis, who I was talking to at the time. And she came in there into the pub with Peter Gabriel. So it's an amazing history that this place has.
1982, XTC recorded their album Big Express here. Echo and the Bunnymen did some recording here. The Icicle Works. I even remember coming down here one day and meeting Barbara Dixon. Now, some of you Americans and Japanese that watch this might not know Barbara Dixon, but in the 70s she was quite a big singer in the UK. So many people went through these doors.
Yeah, My Sharona.
Oh, the Knack.
The Knack, they did it in 24 hours. They did the album, The Knack did My Sharona in 24 hours. And there was one time I was invited by Pete Hamill to listen to some of his music as I was working here with a music charity. He said, come and listen to some of my music, Shaun. And I came in and said, Peter, it's wonderful, thank you for the honour. He said, listen to the bass, you're a bass player, aren't you? I said, yeah, sort of. He said, have a listen. He said, what do you think about the bass? He said, I'll wait for someone else to come in. And another person sat next to me. And I was sat there thinking, oh yeah, well I like the bass. Looked round who was to my right, but John Paul Jones, the bass player of Led Zeppelin. And I'm thinking, why ask me?
So this is Crescent Studios. When we recorded here, of course, you needed food, you needed sustenance. We're going to take you to a place called the Bell in a minute, and the Bell was a very important rock and roll pub of Bath. And before we do that though, we're going to show you a little place just over there on our left hand side, which Shaun's going to take you through a bit of history of. It's Walcott Village Hall. I don't know if you remember this place, Shaun. It really takes this back, doesn't it?
I remember this very well. I remember cleaning it up in my summer holidays when I was a kid with the Bath Arts Workshop.
Wow.
It became an amazing venue, didn't it, for bands?
It did. Especially rehearsals, I remember.
Did you rehearse here?
Yeah, Graduate rehearsed here before our tour of Germany in late 1980, yeah.
And I remember bands like Ducks playing here, which would be Kurt and Roland.
When they were
Paul
13,
Nolan.
14?
14, yeah.
Wow.
Great events happening in here.
Yeah. Again, you know, it was almost the hub of the Walcott community.
Well, Walcott Village Hall gigs were like something you came to, wouldn't you?
Yeah, and right next to it, Shaun, there was a field. It's been built on a lot of it now, but that of course was where the Walcott Festival was held in the 70s.
75, 76, 77,
Yeah.
3 festivals were held on that burial field there.
Wow. So many bands.
Oh,
Yeah.
amazing bands played here.
Even some music going on today in the famous Bell. Shaun.
Amazing, isn't it?
Yeah.
News on a Sunday,
Absolutely.
still the same. Great place to be. And here we are in Chatham Road. Tears for Fears fans, because this is where Kurt was singing Last Day to Play by Blue Oyster Cult when Roland came down the road and heard him sing and said, I want him in my band.
and they formed a band called Ducks, didn't they, when they were 13 or 14 from that singing. And I remember coming here probably 1976, and I met Kurt for the first time in that house then. Yeah. So behind us, as we've already said, is that fantastic old music pub, The Bell.
Wonderful place. Lots of musicians from Crescent Studios used to come down, didn't they?
Yes, you tend to finish a session and come down to the Bell for a drink at the end of the day. And I remember lots of those guys. I remember being in there once with Tony Hatch, the legendary producer and songwriter. He had a few drinks with us in there. But you know, right up to the mid-80s when Peter Gabriel and Kate Bush had a drink in there after recording some vocals on Don't Give Up. Mark Knopfler stopped off after a bike tour on his Harley Davidson to see one of Bath's resident musicians, Mr. Kevin Brown. So it's got a massive history, The Bell. It's all part of that local scene.
It's definitely part, and of course Salisbury Hill was written in this, and out that way, that's Salisbury Hill, an iconic part of Bath. As you come into Bath,
Yeah.
you're coming in this part of Bath into the centre,
Yeah.
and then we head on this way.
We're once again amongst the incredible Georgian architecture of Bath. This time we're in St James's Square, and the reason we're here is because in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, a singer called Van Morrison bought a house here, lived here, and as far as we know, still owns the house.
Well, here we are in Walcott, Thomas Street, and it's number 34 here that Andy Davis and Will Gregory, who met during the Songs from the Big Chair tour with Tears for Fears, lived, and a young lady called Alison Goldfrapp came by, and this is where the band Goldfrapp were formed.
Well, during the 1970s and 80s, this was an important pub where lots of musicians came, but specifically in the 70s, it was quite a hippie 70s rock and roll haunt, and all the bands of the 70s around Bath came and played here. But one interesting and notable story I was told was that the singer of the punk band X-Ray Specs, Polly Styrene, grew up in Bath, and she worked behind the bar here. The reason that I know she worked behind the bar was because one Tom Bailey, singer and writer from 80s band The Thompson Twins, lived along here at some point during the late 70s and early 80s. He came in the pub and bumped into Polly Styrene working behind the bar. It's funny the stories you hear, isn't it? And for the punk fans amongst you, this is Parade Gardens, and on this bandstand in the late 1980s, British new wave punk band The Stranglers played a song called Paradise for a French TV show.
So at the end of 1980, when Graduates split up, it was a bit of an unsure time for Ronan and Kurt. What were they going to do next? And Ronan had a flat here in Barton Street, above that pizza restaurant there. And I think I'm right in saying, Shaun, that Mad World, their very first hit single in the UK, was written there.
That's correct. Kurt and Roland were looking out the windows, and Roland had an inspiration. All around me are familiar faces, worn out places.
Wow.
Bright and early for their daily races.
Going nowhere.
Going nowhere.
It's all about the people, isn't it? It's all
It
about
is.
what he surveyed at the time from his window. So, Shaun, we're going to go to Mole's now, which is pretty much Bath's most iconic music
Of
venue,
course.
certainly of the 80s.
One of the most iconic venues, I think, even in the country.
Absolutely. And then from Mole's, we just end up a little street in Bath, which very few people know about, and certainly the Tears for Fears connection. And that pretty much is in the mid-80s by then, and probably their last sort of bit of Bath history that we need to talk about.
But by then, they'd all moved out of the city. Roland had moved to London. Kurt had moved just outside near Castle Combe.
That's right. So on this next bit of our rock and stroll tour of Bath, we're actually going to go to the city's most iconic music venue. It was called Mole's, only closed probably a year, 18 months ago. But for many, many years, Shaun, this was the hub of the music scene,
This
wasn't
was
it?
the place to play.
Iconic bands played here, Shaun, over the years.
The Eurythmics, the Smiths. Of course, it was Tears for Fears' first ever show, April the 1st, 1982. And
That's where the record company first saw them, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. They came down en masse, parked across the road just there, with the van just to check if they could create an album.
Wow.
And of course they did. So John, this was sweaty, tight, claustrophobic, but lots of great bands played here. What was it like when you were playing here?
Yeah, the first time I played here was with Graduate in 1980. I think we played twice here that year. All I can remember in those early days, there was no stage. And it was, being a short guy, the audience were right on top of me. So it was exactly what you said, claustrophobic, sweaty, dingy, but it had a proper live music venue feel. Always a good PA and a really good night out.
Wonderful place. I remember playing here, playing bass. If you're on the right hand side when the stage wasn't there, they'd go past you to go to the toilet.
That's right.
The men's toilets was right behind the band on the
Yeah.
right hand side.
You'd literally have to move your guitar.
You'd have
for
to
them
move
go
to let
through.
them go to the loo. It was absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And this entrance was iconic. Just coming in there and asking Phil if you're on the guest list or not.
9 times out of 10 you weren't.
No.
According to Phil. But the other thing is get-ins and get-outs. I mean, bands don't love that sort of type of part of the music industry.
Sure.
It was a tough old get-in, you know, getting the stuff from a van that's parked on the side of the road here,
And moving
there,
into this door
into
here.
that one, which is where the changing room was. I say changing room, it's like a cupboard really, but
It was a cupboard. It was a cupboard sitting in there.
And it's amazing, isn't it, to think of all those stories, but the type of people, as we've just said, that grace these walls, you know.
Amazing.
So we've brought you to a little hidden row of houses on the northern slopes of Bath called Ainsley's Belvedere. And Ainsley's Belvedere was one of these houses, was the home of Roland Orzabal from Tears for Fears in the mid-80s, around the time of that massive album, Songs from the Big Chair. And in fact, the origins of that huge hit, Everybody Wants to Rule the World, started here. We're not going to tell you exactly which house, though. You'll have to come on the tour to see that.
Bringing it more up to date at the end of the Rock and Stroll tour, I'm joined by Dave for this one.
Okay, now I've got a story that I've learned about what's happened here more recently, but you've got family history with this, haven't you, as
Both
well?
my brothers were choir boys here in St Mary's. This was our church when we were at junior school.
One of the other stories that goes from this place is that when Muse were recording at Peter Gabriel's Real World Studios just down the road in Box, they wanted an organ for their song Megalomania on the Origin of Symmetry album in 2001. So they drove all the way down with their producer John Leckie to Wells Cathedral, but that didn't work out. They couldn't get permission and the atmosphere was all wrong and it wasn't happening. So they drove back feeling slightly dejected, and as they came through here, saw there was a car park, swung by, Matt Bellamy ran straight into St Mary's Church here, saw the organ was there. There was actually someone playing it at the time. He went up to the organist and said, "Can I have a go?" They let him. After a bit of discussion, they ended up managing to use the beautiful organ sound here on the track Megalomania, which you hear on the Origins of Symmetry album. So that brings us into the 2000s, with this church being new.
But there's also a problem with the lyrics. He needed to know the lyrics.
The vicar wanted to know the lyrics before agreeing to sign off on the recording. So apparently, John Leckie, the producer, says Matt Bellamy quickly wrote some very upbeat, positive lyrics so that the vicar didn't think they were devil worshippers. That's my understanding of the story from the producer, John Leckie.
Well, thank you for joining us on our Rock and Stroll Tours of Bath.
Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed us going down memory lane and visiting some really iconic Bath musical history.
And don't forget that you can join us to do this in person here in Bath throughout the year. So we look forward to seeing you on our next Rock and Stroll Tour of Bath. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.